You have 5 seconds to leave this property or I'm calling HOA security. That's the first thing she said to me. Not hi, not excuse me, not even, can we talk? Just 5 seconds. 5 seconds to disappear from the yard I've mowed, maintained, and lived on for over a decade. At first, I actually thought she was kidding. I looked behind me, then down at the lemonade in my hand, wondering if I'd missed something. Was there a bear behind me? A fire? Nope. Just her. Standing at the edge of my property like she'd just discovered buried treasure and was ready to plant her flag. Her hand was shaking slightly, holding up her phone like it was a police badge, and her lips were pursed so tight you'd think she was trying to stop herself from spitting nails. I didn't move. I leaned back in my chair, made myself comfortable, and took a slow sip of lemonade. Then I said as calmly as I could, "Would you like to speak to the Secret Service agent in the car first? Or after you hang up?" I'll never forget the way her expression changed in that moment. Like her brain short-circuited and started running through every bad decision she'd ever made. And that's when things really started to unravel. The thing is, this wasn't some HOA drama gone slightly too far. This was something else entirely. It had started out as one of those perfect lazy Sundays, the kind where nothing needs to be done, and you're fine with that. I had my old book, the one I always reread when I want to slow the world down. I had my folding chair under the big oak tree I planted 15 years ago, before the neighborhood was fully developed, back when this land was mostly dirt, promise, and blueprints. That tree's got history. Its roots are wrapped around the bones of long days and quiet evenings. I'd made my peace there more than once. So when she showed up, strutting across the boundary like she was inspecting a crime scene, it was more surreal than annoying. At first. See, I'm not in the HOA. Never have been. My property predates the organization entirely. I bought it when the land was still marked by survey flags and not yet mapped into their governing reach. Legally, it's its own island, my own little bubble. But HOA types, especially the self-appointed ones, don't like bubbles. They like rules, uniformity, control, and above all, they love telling people what to do. Karen, though, was something else. She wasn't just part of the HOA. She was the HOA, at least in her own mind. She had given herself a title, printed a badge, laminated it, and wore it around her neck like she was guarding the gates of national security. I'd seen her a few times before, pacing the sidewalks with a clipboard and what looked like a whistle. She gave off that energy like she was one complaint away from calling in an airstrike on an overgrown hedge. But I never expected her to show up at my fence like a sheriff from an old western, trying to run me off my own land. The absurdity didn't end with her little speech either. She genuinely believed she had the power to remove me from my own backyard. She even tried to tell me that this yard, my yard, was actually part of community property, governed by the HOA. And when I told her I lived here, that this house belonged to me and had for years, she just smirked and said, "No, you don't. This house belongs to a federal consultant. We've seen men in suits coming and going. You're probably a squatter." That part actually made me laugh. Not a big belly laugh, more like that exhale of disbelief when you hear something so wrong it loops back around to entertaining. Because the thing is, she was technically right. I am a federal consultant, just not in the way she thought. My work isn't flashy. It's not spy stuff or movie material, but it is sensitive. And because of that, I have a detail. Men in suits, rotating agents, black SUVs. Not for personal safety, but for data protection and logistical reasons. It's just part of the job. But Karen, with her oversized sunglasses and paint-by-numbers paranoia, had drawn her own conclusions, and none of them made sense. Before I could even clarify, she pulled out her phone, lifted it like it was the sword of justice, and said she was calling in neighborhood patrol. That's when Chad entered the scene. I didn't know Chad before this. Honestly, I wish I still didn't. But he made a lasting first impression. He came rolling up in a golf cart, shirtless, tan like he'd been living under a tanning lamp, cargo shorts hiked up like he was preparing for battle. His sunglasses looked like they came with an instruction manual, and his chest puffed out like a rooster on caffeine. In his hand, a megaphone. Yes, a real one. The kind they use to herd people off of beaches during storms. He pointed it in my direction and yelled, "Sir, you are trespassing on HOA-monitored property. You need to vacate immediately." I blinked, looked down at my lemonade, still cold, still my yard, still reality. But I couldn't believe it. This was either the world's worst prank or some kind of HOA LARPing event gone off the rails. I sat there, half waiting for someone to jump out and yell, "Gotcha!" But no one did. Karen was filming. Chad was serious. And a couple of neighbors had started peeking out from their blinds, like they were watching a drama unfold on stage. There was tension in the air, sure, but also a kind of bizarre comedy. Because as wild as they were acting, I hadn't moved an inch, not one, and I wasn't about to. I reached into my pocket, not for anything threatening, just my phone, and dialed Rivera, my lead detail. I kept it short. Might want to drive around back. We've got an HOA situation escalating. He didn't ask questions. Didn't need to. And that's when everything shifted. Because the moment the black SUV showed up and those two agents stepped out, the look on Karen's face was something I'll never forget. All that fake confidence drained in an instant. She was about to learn a lesson that came with government plates and mirrored shades. When you try to evict someone from their own land, you better know exactly who you're messing with. I calmly dialed Rivera, thumb resting on the call button like it was just any other Sunday chore. No raised voice, no dramatic pause, just a simple, practiced tone. Might want to swing around back. We've got a pretty aggressive HOA situation escalating. He didn't ask for details. He didn't need to. That's the thing about working with a good team. They trust the tone, not just the words. Meanwhile, Karen's still clutching her phone like a live grenade, screaming at me that impersonating a federal agent is a crime, and I should expect to be arrested shortly. She's pacing now, walking the line of the fence like she's trying to will it into moving 6 feet to the left. She's yelling something about me being a threat to the neighborhood and demanding that everyone get their kids inside. I look around, not for help, but just to soak in how ridiculous this has become. Chad is still holding the megaphone, but now he's quiet, which might be the first intelligent thing he's done all day. He's just watching, trying to figure out if things have gone too far. They had. They absolutely had. A few minutes later, the quiet hum of a high-end engine broke the tension like thunder after a flash. You could feel the entire atmosphere change. Even Karen stopped pacing. That black SUV rolled up slow and silent, parked right next to my fence like it had done it 1,000 times. The doors opened in unison. 2 men stepped out, not hurried, not rushed, just deliberate. Dark suits, shades, calm as a frozen lake. They didn't look around, didn't size up the scene. They already knew. One of them gave me a nod, then turned to Karen. And in the kind of voice that carries all the weight of official authority without needing to shout, he said, "Ma'am, you need to step away from the property." That was the first time she hesitated. She blinked, like someone waking up mid-dream. Then her face twisted back into defiance. But the damage was done. Her confidence had already started to crack. Chad, for his part, looked like someone had just hit rewind on his entire personality. He lowered the megaphone, shuffled a step backward, and squinted like maybe, just maybe, this wasn't a backyard squabble anymore. Rivera emerged next, stepping casually through the gate like he belonged there. Because, well, he did. He looked at me first, polite as ever, and asked, "Everything okay, sir?" I nodded toward Karen. She's under the impression I don't live here. Rivera turned to her, all business. "Ma'am, this gentleman is a federally protected consultant. You have just interfered with a secure location under active monitoring." You could almost hear the gears in Karen's head grinding to a halt. She tried to recover, opening her mouth to fire back, but for the first time since she showed up, no sound came out. Then came the meltdown. Karen backed up a step, then snapped, "This is fake. You guys are actors. I saw this exact setup in a video once. Don't think I don't know what a scam looks like." I could see Chad start to slowly reverse his golf cart, inch by inch, like he was trying to sneak away from a bear. Rivera pulled out his ID and held it up, plain as day. Karen slapped it away like it was a mosquito. "That's not real. You can't just show me a shiny thing and expect me to believe it." Rivera didn't flinch, didn't argue. He simply turned and gave a nod to his partner. And right on cue, the second SUV arrived. This one didn't need an introduction. Homeland Security logos printed clean across the doors. The look on Karen's face shifted from denial to something closer to pure existential dread. She stammered something about calling the news, which was ironic considering she was already live streaming to her handful of followers. Rivera calmly replied, "Ma'am, you are already live. That should suffice for your documentation." And there it was. That moment where reality and delusion collide, and one has to give way. You could see it all over her face. She wasn't ready for this. Not the SUVs, not the agents, not the federal badges. But instead of backing down like a rational person, she did what she always did. She doubled down. That stubborn streak, the one that made her the neighborhood terror, wasn't going to surrender without a last stand. Karen looked at the agents like they were extras in some community play she didn't approve of. Still convinced this was some elaborate prank, she marched up to Rivera and demanded to see his credentials again. He obliged, holding up the exact same federal badge she had already dismissed. "Please," she scoffed. "I could buy that off Etsy." Her voice was louder now, but it wasn't confidence. It was desperation. Behind her, Chad had stopped pretending. He was leaning against his golf cart, arms folded, eyes darting toward the exit. You could tell he was calculating whether to fake a phone call or just jump the fence and bolt. Karen didn't notice. She was too busy pointing her phone like a weapon, spinning wild accusations about impersonation, fraud, and government overreach into HOA jurisdictions. Rivera gave another nod, and Agent Lin approached with the quiet efficiency of someone used to being ignored until it's too late. He kept his tone calm, steady. "Ma'am, this property is not governed by the HOA. It is registered under federal advisement status with perimeter monitoring. You are currently trespassing." Her eyes nearly popped out of her head. "That's not possible," she barked. "This is a residential zone. You can't just declare land federal." Lin didn't flinch. "I'm not declaring anything. The parcel information is available through the county assessor's office. You're welcome to verify." Karen didn't move. Instead of checking anything, she went full conspiracy mode. "This is a deep state operation. I've seen the videos. This is what they warned us about. People like me being silenced for asking questions." At that point, I nearly lost it. I had to turn away just to stop from laughing. Because she wasn't just wrong. She was the kind of wrong that gets printed on t-shirts and turned into neighborhood legend. She turned to me, eyes blazing, as if I was somehow orchestrating all of this. "You think this is funny?" she snapped. I shrugged. "Kind of." Chad tried one last time to bring some sanity back into the conversation. "Maybe we should, de-escalate," he mumbled, voice low like he was hoping no one would notice he still existed. "Let's wait to hear from the board before doing anything else." Karen whipped around and pointed at him like a general accusing a traitor. No, we can't back down now. This is our neighborhood. We don't take orders from federal actors pretending to be neighbors. Rivera tapped his earpiece and spoke just loud enough for everyone to hear. HQ, advise we may need to conduct a misinformation evaluation. Civilian appears to be escalating under paranoid delusions, possibly influenced by conspiracy materials. Karen's mouth dropped open so fast, I thought her jaw might hit the turf. Did you just call me paranoid? She shouted. That's slander. Rivera raised an eyebrow. Only if it's not true. I couldn't help it. I muttered under my breath. Well, it's not wrong. Rivera turned his attention back to her. You are currently being documented for unlawful interference with a federally monitored property. Continued obstruction will result in detainment. That finally shook her. She backed up a step, eyes darting between the agents, trying to find a crack in the wall she could exploit. But there wasn't one. Just reality. Just consequence. She wasn't prepared for either. And yet, instead of retreating, instead of apologizing, she did what Karen always does. She plotted her next move. Because to someone like her, the truth doesn't matter. Only control. Only the illusion of it. And even in the face of black SUVs and federal agents, she still thought she could win. The next morning, just as the neighborhood was finally starting to settle down from the chaos of Karen's standoff with actual federal agents, I noticed something strange in her backyard. Folding chairs, a cheap card table, a small stack of papers fluttering in the breeze. And then I saw the sign taped to her fence, hand-painted in red and black. Emergency Ho meeting, neighborhood alert. I blinked. She was doubling down. Again. Most people would have crawled under a rock after the humiliation she faced the day before. Not Karen. She'd traded in her fury for fuel, and she was ready to relaunch the crusade. And this time, she'd gathered backup. By mid-morning, a small crowd had formed around the card table. It wasn't massive, maybe a dozen people, but it was enough to give her the illusion of legitimacy. Chad was there, looking like a man who had lost a bet with reality. Next to him stood two older residents, who I recognized as regular HOA meeting attendees. The types who argue about fence paint colors and think kids playing basketball is a public disturbance. On the table were stacks of poorly printed flyers, all warning about unauthorized federal activity and neighborhood integrity threats. She had donuts and coffee and a loudspeaker, which she absolutely did not need but naturally insisted on using. As I watched from my porch with a coffee of my own, I could hear her voice climbing in pitch, repeating buzzwords like infiltration, sovereignty, and emergency jurisdiction. She waved her arms like a street preacher mid-sermon, pointing toward my house like it was ground zero of a nationwide conspiracy. Then she pulled out a laminated diagram, hand-drawn, of course, featuring my property, annotated with arrows and red marker notes. One arrow pointed to my garden hose with the label, possible concealed surveillance cable. Another was aimed at my satellite dish with bold text that read, mind control beam. I nearly choked on my coffee. Rivera, standing beside me with his arms folded, leaned in slightly and asked, "Should we be concerned about the hose?" I didn't even look away. "Only if she builds a catapult." He nodded, deadpan, like he was actually factoring that into his threat assessment. Then, the moment she'd clearly been building toward, the motion. She climbed up onto a plastic lawn chair, clipboard in hand, like she was preparing to deliver a TED talk. "I hereby call for a community vote to remove the intruder from our neighborhood," she shouted. "All in favor, raise your hands." Out of the dozen people there, only 2 hands went up. One of them was mid-bite into a jelly donut and froze halfway, clearly unsure what they were even voting for. The other looked around nervously like they were waiting for someone to validate the decision. It was a disaster. But Karen, she didn't flinch. Motion passed, she declared, with the same enthusiasm someone might use when winning an election. She turned to Chad and demanded that he draft an official HOA order for removal. Chad blinked. Then, with all the energy of a man trying to disappear into the ground, he said quietly, "I think I forgot how to write." It would have been funny if it wasn't so surreal. This woman had spun herself into a fantasy so elaborate, she was now trying to vote me out of a property I legally owned, as if this was a reality show and she could just snuff my torch. I stood there watching the chaos unfold, amazed not by her persistence, but by the sheer depth of her delusion. She wasn't losing control. She'd never had it to begin with. She just screamed loud enough to make people think she did. And now, even the HOA diehards were starting to question if they'd backed the wrong clipboard. And just when I thought we'd reached peak madness, Rivera approached her again, this time holding a tablet. He'd pulled up drone surveillance footage from the past week. "Ma'am," he said, stepping calmly but firmly toward her. "This footage shows you entering this property 7 times without permission. You are recorded making verbal threats and tampering with equipment near the perimeter." Karen stared at the screen for a moment, then shook her head. "Fake. Deep fake. It's all fake." Chad leaned over for a better look, squinted and said, "That looks like your blue visor, Karen." She spun around and barked, "You don't know what you're talking about." Then came the declaration, "That's it. I'm calling the media. The real media, not your government puppets." Rivera simply nodded. "We'll notify them when they arrive." And we both knew that was exactly what she wanted to hear. 2 days later, they came. A local news van, bright and unmistakable, rolled up just past noon. The crew unloaded their gear, while Karen dabbed her forehead with a handkerchief, like she was preparing to give the Gettysburg Address. She marched across her lawn with the pride of someone about to win an award. I could hear her voice as she welcomed the reporter, calling herself a local whistleblower. She claimed she had uncovered a vast network of non-citizen operatives operating under the guise of federal protection. The reporter, a young guy who looked like he'd rather be covering a bake sale, kept glancing between her and my yard like he was silently praying. This wasn't going to end up on national television. Karen escorted him across the street and gestured toward my house like she was unveiling evidence at a trial. She pointed at my motion sensors and security lights. At one point, she even accused my solar panels of intercepting neighborhood data. Then she launched into a rant about how my mailbox wasn't regulation-sized, as if that somehow proved I was part of a government conspiracy. She narrated the entire thing, while the cameraman tried not to laugh. She was spiraling, but the problem was, she didn't know it. Rivera eventually stepped out and made his way to the property line, cool and professional. "Press credentials, please," he said, and the cameraman handed them over without hesitation. Rivera scanned them, nodded, and said, "You are welcome to film on public land. But if you step past this line," he pointed directly at the edge of my lawn, "you'll be trespassing on federally protected private property. You'll be detained if you proceed." The reporter took one look at Rivera's badge and visibly reconsidered every life choice that had led him to that sidewalk. He took a careful step back and said, "We'll just stick to the street." Karen wasn't finished, not even close. "Don't you want the real story?" she shouted. "This is about tyranny." But the cameraman was already packing up. The reporter muttered something about legal liability and practically sprinted back to the van. The antenna dropped before she could get another word in. And just like that, her media moment evaporated. She stormed back to her tent, yanked out her phone, and began live streaming again. "The media has been silenced," she ranted, pacing in circles. "But we will not be silenced. We will expose this fraud. We will not be intimidated by badges and suits and fancy vehicles. This is our neighborhood. She panned her phone across the street and zoomed in on my porch, where Rivera had just returned, phone buzzing with updates. He looked down, read a message, and turned to me. HQ recommends temporary extraction. Media escalation triggered visibility protocols. We're activating relocation procedure. I nodded. It wasn't the first time. Sometimes you don't dig in and fight back. Sometimes the best move is to vanish, let the storm burn itself out. I packed a go bag and locked up the house. As I climbed into the SUV, I turned to Rivera and asked, "You sure she won't jump the fence while we're gone?" He smirked slightly. "We're installing temporary barriers and a few surprises." I raised an eyebrow. "Surprises?" He just said, "You'll see." We left without sirens, no flashing lights, just two black SUVs gliding down the street like shadows retreating before dawn. Karen ran out from under her tent waving her phone, screaming about how they were fleeing before the truth came out. She filmed every second, convinced she was the hero in a story everyone else had stopped watching. But I wasn't worried. I had agents, protocol, and the one thing Karen could never fake, legitimacy. When I left, I figured Karen would eventually wear herself out. Maybe take a few days to reflect, lick her wounds, and come to terms with the fact that her self-made authority had hit a brick wall made of federal regulations. I underestimated her. Again. Because within 24 hours of my departure, her front yard transformed into something that looked like the love child of a protest rally and a fourth-grade science fair. She called it the Community Truth Zone. And if that sounds like a place where logic goes to die, you're already on the right track. Underneath a white canopy tent, which I suspect she borrowed from some unfortunate cousin's wedding stash, Karen had set up a full-blown command center. Folding tables cluttered with stacks of paper, highlighters, markers, a laptop powered by an extension cord. She ran through her window, and a series of clipboards with printed evidence that looked like it had been pulled from conspiracy forums and laminated with hope. But the centerpiece was the bulletin board. She'd created what she called the Neighborhood Incident Map, complete with blurry photos of my house, arrows drawn in red marker, and dramatic labels like Unknown Frequency Source, Government Surveillance Hub, and, my personal favorite, Unconfirmed Disruption Node, which was a picture of my bird bath. The signs alone were worth a museum exhibit. One read, "Defend our block from data mining." Another simply said, "Wake up," in all caps, with 3 exclamation points, and a hand-drawn eye underneath it. She even had a diagram of a man with a briefcase, clearly intended to be me, with arrows pointing at his sunglasses, and the word "listening device" scrawled underneath. It was a circus. No, worse. It was a one-woman fever dream fueled by caffeine and unchecked ego, and she was proud of every inch of it. But then, something I didn't expect happened. The media showed up. Again. This time, it wasn't just a local affiliate on a slow day. She'd reached out to multiple stations, and one actually bit. A real news van rolled up, the kind with a retractable antenna and a crew that looked too experienced to fall for suburban melodrama. Yet there they were, stepping out onto the pavement, as Karen greeted them like she was hosting a red carpet event. She launched into her now well-rehearsed speech about government interference, false authority, and how my shed was most likely a communications jammer. She guided the reporter, an exhausted-looking man in a polo and khakis, toward the edge of her yard, waving her arm like a museum docent. "Right there," she said, pointing to my fence. "That's where they monitor all our devices. Those panels intercept Wi-Fi signals. That antenna isn't just for television, it's for behavioral programming. It's all happening right here in plain sight." The reporter scribbled notes like he was just trying to get through the day without losing his job. Then, as if her rambling wasn't enough, she made her next mistake. She led the crew toward my fence and began narrating her accusations directly in front of my property, gesturing at everything from my garden gnome to the security light over my garage like they were parts of a grand surveillance array. And just as she started claiming that my solar panels were designed to siphon data from local smart devices, Rivera stepped out once again. He didn't say much, just asked to see press credentials. When they were handed over, he nodded and explained, politely but firmly, that the property line they were approaching was part of a federally monitored site. Any steps past this boundary will be considered trespassing on restricted land and will be met with immediate enforcement. The reporter took 2 big steps back and started packing up before Karen could say another word. "You're all just scared," she screamed, waving her phone wildly. "Scared of the truth." But the truth, as always, didn't care how loud she shouted. And the crew. They were already in the van before she finished her sentence. She was furious, raging. She stormed back to her tent and began live streaming to whoever was still watching, pacing like a military general hyped up on bad intel. "We are being silenced," she declared. "But we will not stop until every infiltrator is exposed. They think I'm going to roll over, but I've got news for them. This fight is just beginning." Except, it wasn't. Not for her. Because that afternoon, another vehicle arrived in the neighborhood. But this one wasn't black. It wasn't tinted. It didn't belong to Rivera or Homeland Security. It was a plain white van, unmarked except for a modest federal seal on the side door. 2 agents stepped out, one holding a case, the other a thick binder. They weren't here for surveillance. They were here for accountability. They walked straight up to Karen's door and rang the bell. After a few moments, the door creaked open. And there she was, still in her protest attire, sunglasses and all. She looked confused, a little nervous. The agents introduced themselves, handed her a document, and within seconds her face went from bold to blank. She read it, lips moving silently, eyes scanning quickly. Her posture changed. Gone was the fire. Gone was the fake confidence. What replaced it was cold, dawning realization. That's when Rivera leaned toward me and said, without even a hint of surprise, "That's not our team. That's financial crimes. IRS." Maybe I raised an eyebrow. "For what?" He handed me a tablet with a headline already pulled up. HOA treasurer under investigation for misappropriation of funds. Turns out Karen had been dipping into the HOA budget for years. Landscaping upgrades for her personal yard? Paid for. The tent and signage she claimed were for community outreach? Expensed. A hot tub listed under community hydrotherapy? Yeah, she billed that too. She'd even claimed tax deductions for security enhancements, which included motion lights for her backyard and a pressure washer. And the best part? She never thought anyone would look into it, not while she was screaming about the deep state. By sundown, the HOA board, newly revived and operating under emergency protocols, held a special vote. Karen was stripped of all positions, titles, and access to HOA funds. Chad abstained from voting, probably still trying to figure out what embezzlement meant. But everyone else was unanimous. They were done with her. Officially, completely, and without ceremony. She didn't take it well. She never does. But there was no dramatic speech this time. No shouting, no live streaming. Just silence. Her tent came down that same night, folded quietly by 2 board members who avoided eye contact with each other the whole time. The flyers were trashed. The signs disappeared. And the next morning, when she stepped onto her porch, she was just another resident. No badge, no clipboard, just a sweatshirt, oversized sunglasses, and a tote bag clutched in both hands, like it contained the last of her authority. She didn't wave, didn't look up, just sat on her steps as a moving truck rolled into her driveway and two men began packing her things into boxes. The neighborhood was quiet, eerily so. No kids on bikes, no leaf blowers. Even the birds seemed to hold their breath. It wasn't sadness. No one pitied her. But there was a sense of closure in the air, like the final chapter of a book no one asked to read had finally been finished. When the last box was loaded, Karen stood up, took one last look around, and climbed into the passenger seat of the truck. It pulled away slowly, leaving behind a patch of dead grass where her tent once stood, and a mailbox with a peeling HOA Proud sticker barely hanging on. No one waved. No one watched. They were already moving on. And just like that, the self-declared queen of the HOA was gone. Later that week, I got an invite to a neighborhood meeting, this time hosted by the restructured board. They offered a formal apology, not just to me, but to everyone who had endured Karen's reign. The new president, a quiet woman named Elise, who once got a fine from Karen for planting sunflowers too close to the curb, offered to make things right. They even invited me to serve as a consultant, joking that my experience with federal agents might help keep the peace in future meetings. I politely declined. I'd had enough HOA politics to last a lifetime. But before I left, they unveiled a surprise in my backyard, a smooth stone bench placed under the tree where it all started. Engraved on the front were two simple words, "He stayed," and just below that, in smaller lettering, "Property owner since 2010. It was quiet, subtle, but perfect. The neighborhood changed after that. People waved more, cookouts returned, kids played in yards again. And once, just once, I caught Rivera tossing a ball with the neighbor's dog, laughing like he didn't have a care in the world. The chaos had passed, but I still installed one more motion sensor near the fence. Not because I was expecting trouble, but because I'd learned one simple truth. Sometimes the biggest disruptions don't come from outside threats. Sometimes they wear pastel tracksuits and carry clipboards. And if one ever showed up again, I was ready.